I grew up with a legacy of service. My dad's a minister, and so early on, from my mother and from my dad, I learned that giving back to your community is very important. And when I decided to go in the Air Force straight out of college, I probably wasn't thinking about service. Here I am in Wyoming, I'm a preacher's kid, and the Air Force recruiter came around and I thought, see the world. But very soon, and I think this happens to almost anybody who enters the military, you soon learn that it's something that's much larger than one person. It's much larger than just yourself. And so I was going to spend 4 years in the Air Force. I ended up staying 32 years. And then I got to continue serving military families as a senior executive at USAA. And then, of course, my most recent time as an elected official as the sheriff of Bexar County, of serving the public. So it's, you might say it's in my DNA, and I've found true value in being a public servant. I think it's important that we focus on how we can give back to our community. You know, I came in at a different time. In 1968, when I graduated from college, we were at the height of the Vietnam War. Now, what I didn't know until much later, when I was in the business of knowing these kinds of things, was that in November of 1967, the National Defense Authorization Act was signed into law. There were two provisions of U.S. Code Title X that affected the military and military personnel that were repealed. One of those sections said, women may not rise above the rank of lieutenant colonel or Navy commander. And women may not comprise more than 2% of the armed forces. Now, in today's environment, you think, well, that's ludicrous. How on earth did anything like that ever get in the law? Because today, in the military, women, if they are qualified, can serve anywhere in the military, including combat. So when I came in the Air Force, this law had just been repealed. But that law was put in place in 1947 at the end of World War II, and when the War Act did a couple of things. One, it eliminated the War Department and created the Department of Defense, and it created the Department of the Air Force as a separate service. And men were coming back from the war. They needed to go back to jobs. Women were working in defense industry and were going back to the home because that's when we had a very traditional family structure. And so that was put in place at that time, but when you get into the 60s, things changed. And then into the 70s, we were debating the Equal Rights Amendment and things like that. And women were going into the workplace in non-traditional jobs and doing very different things than what they had done before. So being in the military at that time, I got to see really the change in our culture in the military. Because I started out as an administrative or personnel officer, and 75% of all of the women that entered the armed forces were in those kinds of jobs: communications, some intelligence, administration, personnel, supply, those types of things. But they weren't aircraft maintenance officers. They weren't pilots. They weren't astronauts. And today, we have women who are 4-star generals. We have women who have flown numerous times in space as astronauts. Today, women are on the front lines because unlike World War II, when you had certain echelons of the battlefield is not restricted to just a certain place. And so the role of women has changed dramatically. When I went in the Air Force, and in the 60s and in the 70s, there were race riots at Travis Air Force Base. And so there was a focus on race relations. Then, as the Equal Rights Amendment was being debated and women were coming into the workplace, there was a focus on sexual harassment. And so we got training on social actions, sexual harassment, what was appropriate, what was not. And so you might say that I was at the very beginning, and a lot of this sounds like, gosh, that actually happened? I think the unfortunate thing is we're still debating and dealing with those issues today. And it's about human nature. I believe the issue is really assuring that individuals are developed to their fullest potential. And as I went through the Air Force and retiring as a Major General, one of the opportunities I had was to be the commander of the Air Force Personnel Center. So we managed all of the personnel operations with about 3,000 individuals, military, civilian, Guard and Reserve, and were responsible for personnel operations for the 500,000 military and civilian personnel worldwide. And a part of that, and that was part of my overall responsibility, but even before that, it's a matter of making sure that each individual is encouraged. Each individual is provided opportunities to develop professionally and to get the kind of training and education that's important for them to be able to move forward and move up. That's not restricted to being a man or a woman. But also know that you have to do that very deliberately. Because if you just leave it to chance, what we also know is that we as individuals tend to gravitate toward those who are like us. So it's important to deliberately look at how are we bringing people into the workplace, how are we providing education and training opportunities to everyone, and making sure that when they come up for a promotion, when they come up for a certain position, a developmental position, for example, that each person has been developed so that they can compete at that level. Often what you see, and what we saw early on, was that, oh, we need to put a woman in there. But the problem was that woman may not have been developed or provided the kind of professional development, training, and education to prepare her for taking on that job. And we saw situations where just because of someone's gender or just because of someone's race or ethnicity, they were put in a job that it was well-meaning, but if you don't have the background and the development to do that, you'll fall flat on your face, and then it sets all of that back. I think it's important, what I found not only as I was growing up, but even today. I mean, when I talk to parents, I was just having a conversation with a friend of mine, and his daughter is in high school. And we were talking about she seems to be going a little bit different way and not, focused on going to college. And often young women are not, they're not sure of themselves. And so a way of finding affirmation is not keeping focused on what they can do and what they can achieve in college, but getting some attention. Maybe it's from a boyfriend who's not as focused on what the future is and equal opportunities, but more focused on relationships. And young women, I believe, need to be encouraged. One, get your education. If you have a dream, then take it one step at a time and just keep working toward it. But I think it's important that young women be mentored. I think it's important that young women be encouraged to seek what they want to do and to work toward that. It doesn't happen overnight. It's not handed to you on a platter. And I think the thing that is important for young women to understand is that they have to work. They've got to put effort in to get to where they want to be. And one of the things, I think it's important to have role models. When I was in high school, I had teachers, I had my mother, but in terms of being able to look at someone who was in the business world, who was a politician, who was in public service, who was in the military, there really weren't any role models. And so when I went to the Air Force, Jean Holm was the director of WAF. It was the only colonel's position. There's only one colonel or a Navy captain in each of the services. But there was only one. And so it wasn't like she was really tangible and somebody that I thought, gosh, I can be like her someday. So I've taken that on as a responsibility to encourage young women to pursue what they want to do, not what society wants them to do, but what they believe that they can make a contribution. And it's getting started early. It's what I call being willing to do the grunt work and learning from the bottom. When my first assignment to the Pentagon, I'd been there probably about a year. I was one of not very many young women. And I got a call one day and I was asked to interview to be the exec officer to an assistant secretary of the Air Force. And I thought, wow, that's really. But the job that I was in as a plans and programs officer, which not many women were in, was really the real work of being an action officer working at the Pentagon. And even though this job was up here, I was really supporting someone else. I wasn't doing the work. And so, I think it took some courage for me to say, thank you very much, but I want to get a little bit of experience as a plans and programs officer beneath my belt before I move on to these things. And that served me well because I wasn't just a horse holder. I wasn't just tagging along, you might say. And so it's a matter of earning your spurs and making sure that you're doing the things to learn and to develop professionally. So there's a shared responsibility. One, having those opportunities, but also taking advantage of them. There's a saying, it says, luck is when preparation meets opportunity. Things aren't about being lucky. It's about being prepared, getting the education, getting some experience. And then when that big opportunity comes along, you're ready to say, yes, here am I. You know, whether it's in government or business or small business or whatever, I think we sometimes focus too much on gender issues. I'm a person, you're a person. What is our mission? Because as I was going through these times where we were, debating the Equal Rights Amendment, when women were coming into the workplace, what I always kept in the forefront of my mind was, it wasn't about looking through this veil of, I'm a woman. It was about, I have a job to do. I have a mission. And that job and getting it achieved had nothing to do with me being a woman. It had to do about being a professional, being educated, focusing on what the job was, and getting it done. It's like being the sheriff. Being the sheriff, yes, the fact that I'm a woman is a fact, but it didn't color or change the decisions that I would make because I was a woman instead of a man. And the same thing in the Air Force, the same thing when I was in a Fortune 200 company. It's about getting the job done. Now, I think having that conversation, everybody needs to be on board with that. And sometimes I think we focus too much on our differences than how we are alike. When I look at different attributes that individuals have, for instance, and I remember a lot of men, the way that they approach an issue, it's the frontal attack. They go right after it. But sometimes it's understanding that when you want to get something done, and there's an old saying, and I think it was from Ben Franklin, but many years ago, if you don't have to worry about who gets the credit, it's amazing how much you can get done. So it may not be about you yourself as a woman getting something done. It may be going around it, or going another direction, or maybe going up over it, or getting someone else to carry the message. And what I found when I was talking about issues of feminism or opportunities for women, what I found was sometimes I couldn't be as effective in carrying that message as one of my counterparts who was a man.